from the WorldFAIR project, including how we used FAIR implementation profiles, the cross-domain interoperability framework, and some of our recommendations. So today's session, a quick introduction to WorldFAIR. What is WorldFAIR? Full title, WorldFAIR Global Cooperation on Fair Data Policy and Practice. It was really designed as a project to advance and to explore how we advance implementation of the FAIR principles in a range of disciplines. European Commission funded, but with a remarkable benevolence, I suppose, and farsightedness, recognizing that FAIR implementation, recognizing that research disciplines are fundamentally global, the Commission allowed us to have beneficiaries all around the world. And so it's genuinely a global project. So institutions in the countries that are listed there, including a number of countries outside the European Union and that don't have agreements around Horizon funding. So that was a fantastic opportunity to do a genuinely global project. Because we were concerned with FAIR implementation, we were also keen to engage with what we call authoritative international entities. Some people jar at that word of authority, but I think it's important. There are organizations that can represent particular disciplines and that have a role in coordinating community agreement about practices and adoption of data standards or specifications. And some of those are listed there and were partners in the project. And I think that part of things is really important. And because it was global, we had as key partners in the project CODATA as the coordinator and the Research Data Alliance. And in putting together the project, we pulled on our respective networks, collaborations to put together the case studies. And I think that's an important dimension. On this first slide as well, there are links to the website, to the list of outputs in Zenodo, the webinar series. There are still at least 2 further events, and here are the partners that I've just mentioned and organizations from around the world. And it has been an absolute pleasure to work with these organizations and their representatives over the last 2 years. And I think you'll see in the presentations from the case studies, the richness and the engagement that the organizations have had with the project vision and what we've been trying to do. So something about the thinking behind the WorldFAIR project, implementing the FAIR principles in a range of disciplines. And we always felt this report is getting a little bit old now, but I think this recommendation from the Turning FAIR into Reality report remains relevant and is incredibly important. And to my mind, it encapsulates an important approach to how we implement the FAIR principles, how we make data more effective and usable for research in many different fields and across domains. And I'll say a little bit about that. So 2 parts of this recommendation. Firstly, we need to develop interoperability frameworks for FAIR sharing. And we need to do so, we need to encourage and empower particular communities to develop those interoperability frameworks. And in doing so, to define their practices for data sharing, data formats, metadata standards, etc. And so there's a message there about empowering those communities, and that's something that we've tried to do in the WorldFAIR project. But in doing so, we always need to be mindful of the need for interdisciplinary research as well. The need to resist this temptation or this hazard of setting up disciplinary boundaries, of identifying bespoke solutions for a particular domain, which may work very well, but then trapping data, as it were, inside that particular discipline. And so to avoid that, we need to think about how we express those frameworks in common ways and adopt global standards where relevant. And so there's that duality in how we implement FAIR, and I think in the approach that WorldFAIR has taken. So on the one hand, we have the richness of the case studies. On the other hand, we have synthesis activities, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Just very quickly, some of the background, and really this is the justification and the importance of that interdisciplinary work. CODATA's been exploring this for a few years. We were asked to do so by the International Science Council, our parent body, to try and address the major challenge of making data available and making data work for interdisciplinary research areas. So we've been exploring this for a few years when the funding for WorldFAIR became available. We had already developed some of the methodologies and some of the approaches. And as I say, it was important to draw on organizations and partners that had already been involved in this initiative that's described on the slide there, as well as communities in the Research Data Alliance. And so we ended up with an incredibly ambitious number of case studies, 11 case studies, which are listed in, which are represented here in the famous petal diagram or flower diagram. Each of those case studies is led by an organization which can claim either to be an authoritative organization for the discipline or is a very strongly representative project. And we, in order to make this a bit more efficient, we try to cluster them. So there's a set of case studies on chemistry and materials, so chemistry, nanomaterials, and geochemistry, and so on through social sciences and health, biodiversity, natural, environmental sciences, and cultural heritage. I'll not linger much on this slide because we'll hear from most of these case studies in the rest of the session, but it's important to, I suppose, understand the diversity of the approach, the richness of the activity, the ambition of the project, and also our attempts through all that to synthesize what we were finding from each of the case studies. We did that through a number of steps and a number of activities across the case studies, organized by CODATA's in the synthesis activity that's in the center of that petal diagram. We employed the FAIR implementation profiles methodology, and we'll talk a lot more about that in the session tomorrow. But that's a way of trying to understand what the current and potential practice around FAIR could be is and could be in a particular discipline. We also engaged with a series of meetings and workshops on interoperability issues towards what we call the cross-domain interoperability framework, which is one of the key outputs. And so that leads that process through workshops, through our regular Darkstuhl workshop as well, leads to the main deliverables from WorldFAIR, which is the case studies, the FAIR implementation profiles, and the cross-domain interoperability framework. So these are the outputs, the contributions that come from WorldFAIR, this insight into the international dimension, 11 rich and detailed case studies, and an insight into FAIR practices in those domains, the FAIR implementation profiles from each of those case studies, which will be useful references, the cross-domain interoperability framework, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and recommendations on FAIR assessment and policy recommendations as well. So I'm going to conclude here with that introduction, but with a plug for the final events in the WorldFAIR webinar series. If you want to find out more about our use of FAIR implementation profiles and the cross-domain interoperability framework and some of our policy recommendations, please do come along to the session tomorrow. And this is the end of the project, but it's not the end of the initiative. We are planning, well, there will be, we're not just planning it, there will be an initiative called WorldFAIR Plus, which will include the existing case studies, we hope, and new case studies. and will be coordinated as an ongoing initiative, very much in the same way, with sets of parallel funding, some of which we've already secured, pending any funding like the WorldFAIR Project, so that we can have a coordination again. But we will be carrying on, and certainly in June, there will be further events beyond the WorldFAIR Project in order to initiate further discussion on the cross-domain interoperability framework. So please keep your eyes out for that. So now over to the case studies. We're going to do this in 3 clusters. First of all, biodiversity disaster risk reduction. Then the cluster on social sciences, health and cultural heritage, and finally the cluster on chemistry and materials. Each case study has about 5 minutes to tell you very quickly about what they did, the background to what they did, but above all to highlight key deliverables and key messages from those deliverables, which will be of interest to the wider audience. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I need to know, is Jill with us? I don't think she is. It's late in New Zealand, and she was unsure whether she would be able to make it. One of the challenges we have encountered, as I'm sure you can understand as participants in the RDA plenary, is that a global project means dealing with time zones all the time. So I don't think Jill has been able to make it, so we'll go straight into the GBIF presentation and then the plant pollinator presentation, please.
I will press play. This is a recorded presentation, and if someone can let me know if you can hear everything okay, that'd be reassuring.
Hello, my name is Joe Miller. I'm the Executive Secretary of GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Today, I'd like to describe our work in the WorldFAIR Work Package 9, Biodiversity Standards Development to Implement FAIR Data Actions. GBIF data and that of our global community is a window on evidence of where biodiversity occurs. These pieces of evidence can come from museum specimens, digitized specimens, from observations from participatory scientists, harvested from the literature, and more recently, we're getting large data flows from automated data flows via computer from remote sensing data sets, especially camera traps that are enabled in national parks, but now also from environmental DNA sequences from soil and water, for example. In order to use this data, we need to use common standards, of which we use the Darwin Core standard, and then we use those to publish the data and index the data to allow it to be data discovery and use. The way we've done that is through the Darwin Core data model, which is a star schema which has the occurrence at the center of it. The Darwin Core schema has been very elegant for GBIF and simple, and has allowed us to mobilize nearly 3 billion pieces of evidence about biodiversity. However, there are some limitations to it. We aren't able to show the richness of many of the data types that are available to be shared and reused. Our current GBIF mission in our strategic framework is to mobilize the data, skills, and technologies needed to make comprehensive biodiversity data available for science and decisions addressing biodiversity loss and sustainable development. So part of this mission is to make comprehensive biodiversity information freely available. The Darwin Core star schema is not sufficiently complex enough to enable for us to make this comprehensive biodiversity information available. And this information is critical for nations to report on their obligations to the Convention for Biological Diversity and to meet these great goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the WorldFAIR Project, we have developed this kind of logical framework of building a publishing model for our new data model. We take actual use case narratives of data that is currently available and shared through GBIF, use that through a template, and develop a summary of this narrative that we can turn into a conceptual model of how that data is coordinated and connected to itself. And this is done through user interactions, feedback, seminars, and community input. And from that, we pull out a publishing model that maintains the complexity as much as possible from this conceptual model and works across different areas. This is done in close collaboration with the Biodiversity Information Standards, the TADWID group, which is the group that maintains the Darwin Core standards. So this is what the model looks like. It's an event-based data model built around the event, which can connect many different types of data, not just the small amount from the Darwin star schema. It can connect such as locations, protocols, assertions, agents, which are people that are doing the actions, the organisms themselves, and any material that it's collected digitally or physical collections as well. And all this can be combined into this conceptual data model from which we can pull out subsets for data publishing modules. So the publishing models that we have developed in collaboration with this WorldFAIR project first started around the material specimen, so the materials and collections, camera traps. We'll hear more about the biotic interactions from the next work package, but more recently from the Humboldt extensions, bringing in, starting to develop in the publishing model for ecological data, which allows presence and absence data for monitoring, and as I mentioned, environmental DNA. So this is what some of the data looks like. So this is a specimen data set in GBIF that has been built with the richness of the data available from this specimen, including images, DNA sequences, measurements, assertions, showing the richness of the data that has been published through the model instead of the lesser data from the Darwin Core. And this is a kind of exciting one that we're just starting now on the Humboldt extension on survey monitoring. So DNA monitoring is the next frontier for our planet to monitor biodiversity loss. Some of these monitoring events can be quite simple, equal to an occurrence, but most monitoring events are more complex with events, sub-events, and even sub-events. And the data publishing model is being built in order to keep and maintain this complexity of the data. Thank you very much, and I look forward to continued interactions with the community as we build this long-term data model to make biodiversity data more relevant to science and policy.
Thanks, Joe. In absentia, Joe is in Brazil at the moment for a G7 meeting. And we go over to a different part of Brazil for the next presentation from Deborah Drucker at Embrapa, who was leading the agricultural biodiversity case study specifically on plant pollinator datasets. Deborah, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Hello, everyone. Good morning from Campinas, Brazil. I'm Deborah Drucker. I work at Embrapa as a data manager. Embrapa is the research institution in Brazil on agriculture. And our agricultural biodiversity case study is about plant pollinator data sets. So we recently had this webinar on WorldFAIR where we presented in detail what we did. It's available in the WorldFAIR webpage. If you are interested on more details, please go there later. Today I'm going to talk about the highlights. And the reason we chose plant pollinator interactions is because we were born inside the RDA community of practice on agricultural data, IGAD. And within our community, we detected that many initiatives were interested on maturing standards for interactions, more specifically pollination. It's a very important ecosystem service. It's important for agriculture, but for sustaining life on Earth as well. And as Joe mentioned before, as you saw, we work together with the biodiversity standard, information standards, the TED community, within the biotic interactions interest group also. So together with Embrapa, we also had the Kenyan Agriculture and Livestock Research Corporation, KALRO, Mais Botanic Gardens, Hive Tracks, and the RDA associations as beneficiaries, but we have partners from all over the world. We decided to work building on existing initiatives. One of them is the Global Biodiversity Biotic Interactions Platform. We also work together with TEDWIC in the data publication and together with GBIF with this publishing model that Joe mentioned, and previous initiatives in the Brazilian Plant Pollinator Interactions Network, the HEBIP. We developed a data schema, a vocabulary, the Plant Pollinator Interactions vocabulary, and we also work with the ecological metadata language, which has been out there for a while. And we also detected that our approach was very similar with the new data model from GBIF. So that's interesting coincidence that the community was moving towards the same approach. So we recently published the two last deliverables from our work package, which I invite you to read. We had 6 pilot studies, so it was based on initiatives from all over the world. They are listed here. I cannot go into detail right now, but it was really important and fruitful collaboration between many initiatives. So our key messages from our case study is that we had the collective efforts to share plant pollinator interaction data, and that's needed to address global challenges. Because we mobilized, we really made available lots of interactions data to the community, and that's something that was lacking for such an important ecosystem service. We also had this approach of reuse, adapt, and connect tools, and it was successful. And I would like to explore a little bit this architectures of organizations that it's based on a publication on the Open Trades Network. That's also into the biodiversity domain. And we believe that this third approach here, it's the one that we had, where we have different and sometimes connected, sometimes not connected initiatives, and we have some synthesis nodes, in our case, GLOBI and GBIF, and this worked very well for our initiative. So we were able to connect these communities, share knowledge, and also work on reviewing data sets for its quality. And we also were able to build bridges between existing initiatives. So if you are interested on standardizing plant pollinator data, there is this cookbook that's available with more details. Also, if you want to connect with our network, we are continuing with this initiative through other projects. And all our deliverables are available in the WorldFAIR webpage. So thank you very much for your attention, and to our partners and for the WorldFAIR. Over to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And I hope that was for colleagues attending, that people could see that that was a useful way to kick off this session, to see GBIF as the global infrastructure and the revision of their of their unified data model, and then to look at the specific needs of what might one call a subdiscipline, and really to see how Deborah and her colleagues coordinated across a number of organizations globally, and that challenged her. And I think that that third way is really important as well. We can't allow ourselves to have these disconnected islands of what amounts to very small interoperability. It's improbable that we can have decentralized coordination, and therefore that third way I think is really important. Colleagues, are there any questions for Deborah or on the biodiversity case studies that we've started with? Any feedback or response from colleagues who are attending? As I say, we're going to do this in 3 clusters to give you the chance to ask questions rather than listening to all the case studies all at once. But I wonder if there are any questions, any observations at this stage. And that can be from colleagues within the WorldFAIR Project or outside it as well. Graham, please, you've raised your hand, please ask your question.
Hello. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the camera button. I don't know where. Oh, yeah, there it is. Hi there. Yeah, really nice presentation there, Deborah. Thanks for that. And yeah, to introduce myself, I'm Graham Dyack. I'm a data specialist with the Atlantic Salmon Trust in the UK, and I'm kind of one of the projects we want to work on, and we're probably going to do it through the RDA, a kind of interest group with a working group spinning off, is a controlled vocabulary for salmon research. And so my question is just, yeah, how did you guys find building the controlled vocabulary? You know, is it horribly hard, or is it, once you got enough people together to do it, was it actually, you know, quite a smooth process? And yeah, that's kind of my question. Thanks.
Thank you, Graham. The control vocabulary was built before the WorldFAIR project started by the Brazilian network on plant pollination interactions. It was a huge effort from dozens of institutions. It took years. It was really hard because we found ourselves with more than 100 terms, and it was hard to concentrate on the most important ones. And what we realized within the WorldFAIR project is that, yes, we need to expand it, and we are already doing that. So we have a GitHub space where the community is suggesting new terms that they found absent, and we are continuing to develop. And I think that's going to be a continued effort for a while.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I think that collaborative build-up, that's what we want to do. We want to be able to invite people in and have some kind of platform where it's easy to suggest terms, and yes, that kind of Wikipedia style working up of a vocabulary. But yeah, it's good to see that as an example, and I'll definitely be taking it to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. And yes, I mean, something I think that we would stress that's clear, there are no shortcuts. It is hard. Data is difficult. Concepts are difficult. All we can do, but it's really important and necessary to have the controlled vocabularies, to have the ontologies. It does take work, and it requires effort and investment and collaboration and coordination, and not doing it in islands as well, not thinking that, okay, we can pull together a list of terms for our own project and that will be fine. That will make a silo. It will lead to a lack of interoperability. It will require a whole load of more work and mapping in order to integrate those data eventually with other data globally. Any more questions or comments for the biodiversity case studies? Seeing none, we will move on to the social sciences block. Thank you very much to Deborah and Joe. And we'll kick off with the social science and health block. And the first presenter will be Steve McEachran from the Australian Data Archives. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Simon. Let me just share up now. Shift. Oh, sorry, folks. I'll just switch to the other screen. There we are. Okay, so I'm Steve McEachran I'm director of the Australian Data Archive. Just to start with an acknowledgement of land. The traditional owners of the land season was the area that I live and work and meet on, which is the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Eastern Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So the social science work package 6 in a lot of the WorldFAIR information was a collaboration between Australian National University and SICT, the Norwegian Agency for Shared Services in Education and Research, and Hilda Orton from SICT, and possibly others are here from on the call as well. Who we are, ADA is a social science data archive providing national service collection and preservation of research data for secondary use. Similarly, SICT develops, acquires and delivers services for education and research, including a social science data archive. That part of the group is based in Bergen in Norway. And some might know it previously as NSD. The collaboration, we've been working together on offer for a lot of years through the Data Documentation Initiative, DDI, but this was an opportunity to really look at some collaborative practices. Both organisations are both involved in international social survey projects, including the European Social Survey, which is an EU-funded project, and a broader related program, the International Social Survey Program, which is a collaboration on social surveys across 40 countries. We both provide data archiving services. We both conduct social survey research projects, and we're both members of the DDI Alliance. So what we were looking to do was really see in a concentrated way, how could we improve interoperability of social survey practices across countries in the commonly active area of comparative social surveys. So what we were looking to do was a comparative study of data management, harmonisation, integration practices, oriented around the European Social Survey, but also one of the satellite countries, Australia, had just conducted a satellite replication of the European Social Survey as well, prior to the commencement of the WorldFAIR Project. And so we were able to, what we wanted to do was see what opportunities there were for improving and coordinating administrative data, metadata management, and technical environments. Particularly to use the DDI metadata standards to understand how multinational collections, which often involve 10, 20, 30, 40 countries, could be made more effectively interoperable and reusable. And we were one of a number of studies, web packages doing this type of work in the program. And trying to establish a set of guidelines and tools for development of cross-national collections into the future. Essentially, we're working very much down the weeds with the data itself. Here's an example here of trying to say, well, if you wanted to measure marital status across multiple countries from multiple data sets, what's the sort of integration you need to do? And this is the DDI model for representing content in this way. Here's our common concept, how it gets represented, using what sort of codes, what sort of terminology do you use in different countries, and then specifically in particular data sets, how do you then chain those things together effectively? So in order to do that, essentially what we did throughout the project, we started with a review of our data management practices in Deliverable 1. Deliverable 2, then we tried to identify what were some of the key best practices that were occurring in social survey data integration internationally, and went through a number of essentially workflow processes that existed, both in public documentation and internally within some of the collaborators that we worked with. To essentially see if we could establish a harmonization workflow that we could put forward as a pilot for testing in doing some more detailed data integration. So this was the output of deliverable 2, essentially establishing a headline harmonization workflow that progressed. Certainly we could look at establishing and testing some of the administrative workflows and process workflows that we use, but increasingly seeing the extent to which we might be able to standardize and then interoperate at the level of technical infrastructures to improve those harmonization workflows between, in this particular case, between the Norwegian archive, which held often a lot of the conceptual information and template information, and then in the Australian case where we were doing a lot of the data matching and integration to coordinate our data into the template European Social Survey. Deliverable 3, then we focused on, or how useful is that workflow as a process in and of itself. So, say we would recommend reading deliverables 2 and 3 in conjunction. 2 sets out what we see as sort of best practices. 3 what happens when we trial this out with a pilot data integration, and we use the International Social Survey Program for this. And this is kind of a headline indicator of how successful the different stages in that process were. Using a sort of a simple traffic light indicator. Red was unsuccessful. Yellow was needs improvement. Green was complete successfully. And what we were able to establish was a lot of the detailed harmonization work can be done quite effectively using once you have established registries in place, if you can interoperate with them fundamentally. We weren't able to do so, particularly data type harmonization, which is often dealing with variable formats, data types, and so forth, and that is an important part of the process. But certainly at the level of having to deal with integrating, codes and concepts. What does M mean? M and F mean, or what 1 and 2 if you're including it in a table. That sort of interoperability is possible to do in a machine actionable way. The hard part was really getting the interactivity itself in a suitable time frame. So importing data and then extracting content to document the harmonization process was one of the key challenges that actually slowed down the process itself. We were able to progressively develop some of the some tools to support this more effectively. This is an example of the automated documentation tool that we piloted to try doing sort of automated matching of categories. And similarly, SICT has been working on an automated tool for provenance information that we hope to conclude as part of the project as well. Key messages, though, and this is where I'll wrap up. Essentially, the availability of registries to be able to interact with the metadata, but particularly be able to provide standardized access controls to speak, essentially machine to machine speak to those. Can your APIs work effectively to be able to interoperate? Are a key part to making these processes work effectively. Code repositories to allow us to be able to interact with them effectively, and similarly code libraries for once those registries are established to enable them to be able to reuse effectively become a key part of this. So say the more we can share those sorts of standardized interactions on a machine actionable level, the more effective this sort of integration work will be able to be. Without those controls, we still ended up having to use quite a lot more manual processing than we expected. I'll leave it there, sorry.
Thank you very much, Steve. Again, that detailed work of data integration and interoperability. We'll move straight on to Keith Tomlin from Work Package 7 on population health. Keith, over to you.
You're muted, Keith.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just obtaining the right screen in my layout. It's not appearing in my share options just at the moment. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes,
Yes.
not yet in full screen mode, though.
Let me just try and address that. Actually, the bit I need to click is the bit I can't see.
Icon at the bottom, or slideshow.
We'll leave that as it is for now. And I'll make a start. So, hello everybody. Hello from London. My name is Keith Tomlin. I'm an epidemiologist. I'm based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. For Work Package 7, we have primarily collaborated with CODATA and with the African Population Health and Research Centre. We've also had other key collaborators from South Africa and Malawi and Tanzania. I wanted to give just a little bit of background to where we started from. There are a number of sort of bodies that were looking at data integration and harmonization from some time ago. The one that I was most closely connected with was the Alpha Network, which was looking expressly at population-based HIV/AIDS data on Africa. This started up in about 2005 at a time of clearly a period of sort of chronic international crisis around HIV at the time. It was initially a collaboration between 10 longitudinal population-based studies across Southern and Eastern Africa, all of which had demographic, behavioral, socioeconomic, and clinical data that we wanted to be able to bring together in a harmonized way across all of the collaborating sites. And the advantages of doing this were to massively increase the amount of power that we had in the data that was available to us, and to be able to reliably report on things like mortality and incidence of HIV across multiple locations. And as a result of doing so, is able to provide some quite unique data on HIV incidence and mortality that hadn't been available from other individual sources in the past. And so in a way, this was an early example of harmonization and within domain interoperability to some degree before the point at which we are really talking about things in those terms. Following on from Alpha and another of other similar collaborations, we wanted to expand this network to a larger number of contributing sites with a broader portfolio of health interests. And from that grew a body called Inspire. It was largely sort of grew out of the work of Alpha and some other data harmonization projects. We wanted to explore more fully how to align and recognize standards for sharing population health data in a way that wasn't so entirely specific to what we had been doing within Alpha. Alpha worked in a very enclosed kind of a way. It was effective within the projects who were part of it, but it wasn't so easy to work with those data outside of that collective of organizations. We also wanted to be able to support analyses that by definition relied on very sensitive personal information. So we were increasingly in an environment where data were not being readily shared across organizations, certainly not clinical data. And we were working within these kind of federated environments in which data was largely being retained within the organizations in which it produced it. So Inspire became this collaborative network of a number of other Southern and East African collaborators. It initially focused a lot, as you can imagine, on COVID-19. And in terms of what we did within WorldFAIR, a strong element of that work was around the idea of how do you create the FAIR principles from what was standardly available health data. And so within the deliverables that we've put together, the first, an implementation guideline for how to annotate health research data and harmonize that across any kind of health data collecting institution. What then grew out of that was a resource library, a training package, which is a series of videos, which really were intended to take an organization pursuing this right through a kind of a pipeline approach, if you like, from starting off with standard collected WHO data and transforming that through a process through which the FAIR principles became evident. And then finally, all of this was brought together into a policy and practice recommendation manual, if you like. This is the third deliverable that we're finishing up right now. And the key messages that have come out of all of this, the core recommendations, if you like. Firstly, many of our data producers are new to producing metadata, to thinking in terms of metadata, and to adopting ways of standardizing that. And so firstly, working with the approach of the DDI is something that we would recommend to help institutions to move forward. The second key thing is around the adoption of a common data model. And for electronic health and other demographic records, we're recommending using the Odyssey OMOP CDM, which is essentially a very large and very detailed relational database for bringing specifically clinical and health-related data together. As we've talked about before, the use and development of structured data vocabularies, of standardized vocabularies, is essential. And we're also promoting the use of a metadata documentation standard called schema.org. And this is an approach, a standard which is adopted by some of the other WorldFAIR packages in terms of documenting metadata in a way that makes it more readily shareable and machine readable and machine actionable as much as anything else. And in terms of doing that, we've also recommended the use of a markup language of JSON LD, which enables you to embed directly into web pages the kind of metadata language that machines can understand. So those are the main steps that we've been working on. In terms of what may happen next, two relatively new developments that are kind of embracing these ideas, particularly around interoperability, is the Blueprint for an African Population Cohorts Consortium, and also a new project very recently launched funded by the Wellcome Trust called Data Science Without Borders. And this is looking to expand beyond our usual East and Southern African context, and is looking at greater means of reducing the kind of the coding requirements in order to produce interoperable data in the way that we hope to. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was extremely interesting and helpful. We'll move straight on to the next two presenters, but colleagues, please do think of questions for Steve and Keith in the meantime. Next presenter will be Anna Ortigosa from Now with PAHO, but at the start of the project was with the Salabal project at Drexel. Anna, the floor is yours. I think you're muted at the moment.
Can you let me know if you see my screen?
We can see your screen and we can hear you now as well, yes.
Okay.
But the slides aren't presented yet. You need to make them full.
Let me try to see. Now can you see now the presentation mode?
I see you've clicked it. It's taken some time to come through. We're still seeing the slides in slide sorter mode for the time being.
I don't know if you are able to see that now. Let me try to.
It's still in the slide sorter mode.
Anna, I had exactly the same problem, but we can see everything. Ah, there you go.
Let me see now.
That's
Okay.
right. Yes.
Okay, sorry for the inconvenience. My name is Ana Ortigosa. Good morning, everyone from Washington, D.C. I'm going to speak on behalf of my other colleagues that are at Drexel University, which was where was this project host, and also on Teresa Anderson, who was also a collaborator from CODATA. This work package is on urban health, and it's based mostly on a project called SALURBAL, which is the acronym in Spanish for urban health in Latin America. As an urban health as a discipline that combines different knowledges and expertise from researchers from different backgrounds, we believe that it was a special case study for social science that converged not only the socio-demographic characteristics of populations, but also other kind of data that tries to understand how the built and social environment in cities are affecting population health. So mostly our efforts were related to combine and articulate different sources of data in 11 countries in Latin America that belong to data that's systematically collected, but as also sharing the same challenges as Work Package 7, where many of these countries doesn't share a common language in terms of standardization of the same sources of data, or also across different sources of data, there are no some standardized ways of operationalize this. So through the case of a SALURBAL project and the experience of doing this for this project, the overall goal of Work Package 8 was to refine data stewardships and approaches to create some recommendations, because this has been a practice a little bit unprecedented in the urban health field, to create best practices on fair principles, and not only fair principles, but also CARE principles, which are more ethical principles related to indigenous sovereignty of data, but that could also apply to other ethical concerns related to data, and contribute also to the promotion of best practices in data sharing among a community of practice in urban health. And so our goals can be divided in two parts, one that are more related to the operationalization of the FAIR principles through the creation of this FAIR implementations profile for SALURBAL project, and also some guidelines related to the harmonization that we have done of many national health surveys across the countries. And the other part, or the other goal, was more on trying to disseminate and involve other stakeholders working with data in urban health, not only in Latin America, but also within the Urban Health Collaborative at Drexel, and also expanding this community to the US context in different other projects working in the same way on urban health. And so in this line of action, we created a summer course that was taught last year about how to create data management plans for research with CARE and FAIR, and a community of practice that also was is now starting to expand in terms of how we create common language and metadata procedures for standardize our work. And so just to remark these last two deliverables, we have last week, actually, a very interesting meeting or gathering for almost a week that we call Treating Your Data Fairly and with Care, a conversation about data efforts at Drexel, Philadelphia, and beyond. And many of these projects working with many different sources of data oriented to urban health convene and try to explain the many challenges they have in the different aspects of FAIR principles, going from the accessibility, the interoperability, and reuse of the data. And I think it was the inception of a very interesting community to start working together in creating best practices, sharing best practices, and a conversation about common languages. The other aspect we also would like to remark, also being in progress since the beginning, but having a final shape with the deliverable 8.2b, that updated FAIR implementation profile for the WorldFAIR project. We were able to, throughout these 2 years of actions and activities within these projects, to contextualize the FAIR implementation profile for adapting the FAIR principles to the local needs, at least the project needs, but this also be transferable to other experiences with projects, local projects as well, to implement FAIR principles and trying to move slowly towards a common DDI endeavor or effort as metadata standards for describing data in WorldFAIR. I'm putting there the link to the WorldFAIR platform. As you can see, that is also open to researchers for customize the data they would like to use and create their own sources of data, or customize the sources of data for their own research. And just to finalize, the lessons learned that we can say from this project, the WorldFAIR, and participating in the work package H so far for us has been a very useful experience to share and finding support, not only within our own cluster of social science, but also sharing the same challenges on other part of this petal that is the symbol of WorldFAIR. Was very supportive to find a common framework and ontology and trying to move on a community of practice. It was also the process of implementation. This profile has also helped us to understand and discuss the issues related to common language and the needs of this convergent matrix because we are working with the data from different origins and from different nature. And also we are moving forward to this idea of trying to emphasize the need of domain-specific aspects for FAIR and care, and trying to operationalize these FAIR and care principles more to the context of urban health. So thank you very much, and turning over again to Simon.
Thank you very much for that, Anna. And as I remarked in the chat, again, one of these examples of the need for harmonization, data integration, interoperability, but also with important points about the use of the care principles as well. Last in this block, we'll have Beth, I think Beth Kazook from the Digital Repository of Ireland and the Cultural Heritage Work Package. Beth, over to you.
All right, I'm assuming you can see my slides, although apparently that's a dangerous assumption in this presentation.
No, we can indeed. We can indeed. And
okay.
in presenter mode as well. Thanks.
Perfect, very much. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm here to talk about Work Package 13 and sharing cultural heritage images as data. As Simon introduced me, my name is Beth Kazook. I'm project manager for research data at the Digital Repository of Ireland and coming to you today from Dublin. The DRI is, as I mentioned, the work package lead for the cultural heritage case study. It's Ireland's national repository for arts, social sciences, and humanities data. It encompasses quite a lot of data from the cultural heritage sector, as well as what we would kind of more traditionally think of as research data being produced by individual researchers at academic institutions. So from the get-go, DRI has had kind of a unique mix of things that required support from research data principles like the FAIR principles, as well as support for practices coming from the cultural heritage sector, which are very well established at this point in time. So coming from both academic and cultural heritage domains. We were an early adopter of the FAIR principles for research data. Our former executive director, Natalie Harrower, I think was one of the contributors to that Turning FAIR into Reality report. And so I think maybe a little bit selfishly participating in the WorldFAIR Project gave us an opportunity to kind of take a really good look at ourselves and how well we were delivering on a kind of harmonized approach for the researchers as well as the cultural heritage sector in both kind of providing access to data as well as ensuring its reuse across domains. It also gave us a platform to champion our approach if in the course of examining our work, we found that we had a really good model that others could follow. This gave us, you know, again, a platform to kind of share that with others and say, hey, maybe you should look at us. So we produced 3 deliverables over the course of this project. They were focused specifically on sharing images in the cultural heritage domain, as we recognized that this was already kind of an area of convergence across practices, different types of organizations in the sector. And you can see here on my slide, I apologize, it's like pretty small, but you can see there's a chart there where we looked at a variety of image sharing platforms that specialize in delivering cultural heritage images, or on which you can find quite a lot of cultural heritage images that would have been described using different metadata standards and created for different purposes, you know, perhaps for an archive versus a library, and yet they've come together, they've been aggregated and shared and made discoverable and accessible through things like Digital New Zealand or the Digital Public Library of America, the Europeana platform if you happen to be in Europe, and then more broadly on things like Wikimedia Commons and Flickr. So we looked technologically at like what were the standards and what were the technologies that were being used in order to support this exchange of information. We also looked at policy and practice guidance championed by leading professional associations which govern practice in the sector. So the International Council on Archives, International Federation of Library Associations, International Council on Museums, and then we threw in the OCLC and the Society of American Archivists for fun. And then we produced this our first deliverable, which was a review of policies and practices in the sector. And it really helped us to place DRI practices, again, within accepted cultural heritage practices and to see where we might be doing things a little bit differently. And if you read kind of down to the end of that report, we do kind of have a conclusion section that looks specifically at how does DRI stack up to what we've discovered or what we're saying are common practices. We then took that information and we put it together with a working group, an international working group of collections managers, librarians, archivists, researchers, IT professionals, policymakers, to help us review the landscape report and then put that into alignment with FAIR. So you'll find in the first report, the focus is really on just like, what is the cultural heritage sector doing and how can we learn from it? And the second report, which I am about to switch over to, looks at how does this align with FAIR and what could we be doing better? So this is, I would say, really a key output for our work package in that it presents general recommendations that target really clear areas of difference in approach to delivering images as, you know, access for the general public to make things accessible so that people have access to their history and cultural heritage versus reuse as data, things that are actually attractive and interoperable with, data in some of the various other work packages that you've heard from today. It really, we found, required not so much a focus on changes to metadata standards or technologies, but a conceptual shift towards an idea that the digital assets, which we tend to think of as digital surrogates, are in fact not reference material, but the data that's being used. It is, these digital images are data and need to be thought of and maybe characterized that way. Cultural heritage professionals need to start to think of themselves as data creators and not just communicators, I guess, of information. So our 5 recommendations that came out of our report focus on how digital images are presented for citations, again, to kind of recognize that the particular digital image that you're looking at and the metadata that was supplied by a particular institution really is the intellectual framing for that object that is being reused. And so it needs to be credited appropriately. A transparency around the management of digital files and their metadata, which is something that kind of, if you have digitization workflows at cultural heritage organizations, those are things you think of as like not interesting to the general public, and yet it's really critical that you explain, what kind of camera you used and what the process was, what the selection process was for the digital images that you've made accessible online. That becomes really critical information for images to be used appropriately and to try to mitigate against some of the problems that we've since discovered with large big data inquiries into cultural heritage, which can perpetuate biases and problems with historical framing of cultural heritage records that just get kind of propagated through to the digital. We also have a recommendation for, again, like completeness of kind of the administrative and provenance data that is often kept by institutions, but again, not necessarily shared with the public because it wasn't previously thought that that was valuable or of interest. Recommendation around better clarity around licensing and rights, and particularly using things like rights statements to make them machine actionable rather than free text human readable rights. And some more recommendations around delivery generally, support for identifier schemas, APIs, and machine readable contextual data as opposed to just human readable contextual data. Our final deliverable is really a case study of the Digital Repository of Ireland, looking at these general recommendations and saying, how do these apply to what we are currently doing at DRI? And what could we be doing better? So if you read that last deliverable, you'll see what we did to modify our citation style in order to align with our recommendations. You'll see a survey of membership about digitization practices that can help us to better showcase how things come through the digitization pipeline. We are looking at enhancing DRI's existing guidance on providing contextual information, and particularly using a data sheet that was developed by a Europeana working group, data sheets for digital cultural heritage data sets. We've added rights statements. We've added a metadata statement to our record to make clear that the metadata is licensed differently sometimes than the digital object. And we have a series of use cases and a data exploration workshop that's happening tomorrow at the University of Limerick to help us to better improve how we deliver images for reuse. And very quickly for this audience, I want to focus on another important outcome aside from our deliverables of this work package, and that is the development of the community of people who are really talking about this work. And I know that we've tapped into a community that already existed. It's not like DRI can take credit for it, but I feel like we've had a real hand in helping to corral some of those people together and bring them over to the RDA. So we took our working group that we put together to help us develop the recommendations. We invited them to participate in a BOF at the last RDA plenary. Why aren't we talking about collections as data? We have since been working on a charter, which we published for community review in February, just this past February. And we're sorry, we're taking over. This is important to note. We decided that we aligned really well with an existing interest group, and that is the Archives and Records Professionals interest group, which had kind of gotten a little bit quiet, and they thought maybe a shift in focus towards collections as data would be appropriate. So if you're looking for us on the RDA website at the moment, you'll contact us through the Archives and Records Professionals interest group. We are hopefully very shortly going to produce our updated template charter and more appropriate branding that fits with our interest group. And finally, just because Simon mentioned that there are some activities ongoing in June that are continuing after the project has closed, DRI is hosting our Digital Preservation for the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities biannual conference in Limerick this year on the theme, the topic, collections as data. So if you want to come and talk to us there in person and learn more about the WorldFAIR Project and many other collections as data projects happening mostly across Ireland and Europe, then please feel free to join us.
Thanks very much,
I think
Beth.
that's it.
That's great. Fantastic. Thank you, and thanks for mentioning those outcomes as well. So, any questions? I saw one in the chat from Joyce. Joyce, would you like to ask your question? Are you able to unmute, or shall I ask the question from the chat? And if colleagues, anyone else, please either raise your hand or put the question into your chat. This is a question I'm not hearing from Joyce. I will ask the question. It's one for Keith. In the data gathering, Keith, was there any gathering of evidence about cultural practice, culture, behavioral issues, or whatever around about either HIV/AIDS or around COVID? Was that something that the researchers were interested in? Were there any data points around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the projects that contributed to the Alpha Network originally were all HDSS sites, so health and data surveillance sites. And built into the remit of those HDSS when they were set up was to try and measure or to gain an understanding of cultural practices that may influence health outcomes. And so that is why quite a range of demographic and sort of social information was gathered. What we were primarily trying to do was to try and get a handle on HIV incidence primarily. And so we were very focused initially upon accurate measures of things like migration in and out of an area in which we were measuring time, because that is what we were based upon. But we knew that there were very strong cultural influences upon things like who was on the move and at what age were they on the move, where were they going to, where were they working. There was a very pronounced difference quite early on in the East African profile of the epidemic around some of the fishing communities around Lake Victoria. So there was a lot of information gathered around the age and sex of people who were moving, the frequency with which they were moving, and the impact that this potentially had on things like transmission. So there was certainly a remit within the HDSS and then consequently within our own work to try and reflect upon that. We've done a lot of work on sexual behavior, extraordinarily difficult to measure, but it is there and it is possible. There are elements of culture that you simply can't measure in many settings around sexual behavior, but those we've been able to, we have done. So there was always a sense of trying to sort of understand the detail of what individuals were doing, because that is what became necessary to try and understand what was happening within different pockets of the epidemic. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that was a very rich and interesting and insightful answer, Keith. And I think one of the things that it points to is just how rich, but also challenging, dealing with those HPSS data and the clinical data that was being combined in Inspire, how challenging that was. And it's one of the things that we see in a lot of the case studies. We've got legacy data, some of it incredibly rich, but still facing challenges with that of how we combine it. Think of the examples that Keith, Steve presented, how we combine that with additional data sources and how we do that process of harmonization, combination, interoperability. These challenges we encounter them from case study to case study to case study across the domains. And this is something that I think is important to take away from WorldFAIR.
I think that's very true. And I think in some situations, the sort of data connectivity was made easier. For example, if an HDSS also included the setting up of the clinic, and if everybody was ascribed the same numbers, so their clinic records and their residential records were all identifiable in the same way, then that took a lot of the work away from trying to link people together. So it, as is always with these things, the better that you're able to set up these infrastructures to begin with, the less challenged you are in trying to bring different sources of data together retrospectively, which is what many of us are now engaged in, particularly the cross-domain work, where those kind of linking mechanisms don't exist because nobody thought at the time that we would be doing this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we see that in Work Package 7, in all of the work packages that are presented in this block, I think, and also in the biodiversity work package as well, that same challenges of, oh, how do we link legacy data, which is so rich, but we didn't think about it at the time, and lessons there for the future. I don't see any further hands up or questions in the chat. So I'm going to take the opportunity to move on to the next block. So thank you for that group of presenters. Thank you very much. And our next presenter will be, I think I've listed this in a slightly unusual order, but we'll go with Isolt next, please.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Just sharing now. Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to present the nanomaterials highlights. So I will start just by explaining why nanomaterials are part of chemicals, but separate from chemicals, and have a lot in common with geochemistry materials as well. So I'm presenting this on behalf of the team that worked on it. So Andreas Afantitas from Nova Mechanics and Thomas Exner from 7past9 and the team at Birmingham. So nanomaterials are both chemicals and particles. And one of the challenges we have with them is that they are so dynamic. So they aren't static. You can't just say, here is a chemical, this is its identity, and it will be the same unless it undergoes a chemical reaction and is transformed into something else. So with nanomaterials, because they have so many of their atoms are at the surface, they are almost continuously transforming or undergoing reactions. And we need to be able to document that. So they can be all sorts of transformations, even during storage or as we're studying them, which of course then makes connecting the composition of the material with any impacts on humans or the environment quite challenging. So we have been conscious of this for a long time. So one of the things we have been doing for a long time is developing this idea of an instance map, and the instance here being an instance of a nanomaterial. So the nanomaterial as it was synthesized, the nanomaterial as it's dispersed into a particular medium for a characterization, the nanomaterial as it's then presented to an organism for testing, and so on. So we've been used to using this concept of tracking the nanomaterial's fate. But what came out of some of the work that we've been doing in WorldFAIR, particularly as part of the CDIF, the cross-domain implementation framework, where we were looking at how other people are representing and presenting samples and provenance information about their samples, is that we can also use the instance map in reverse to tell us about the nanomaterial's provenance. So what has changed in the nanomaterial as it has gone through these steps from synthesis through storage, through transfer from one lab to another, and then dispersion and characterization and evaluation of toxicity. So that has been one of I would say, one of the most profound understandings that we have gained through the work in WorldFAIR and the understanding of how other domains, not even domains that are that far from ourselves, such as geoscience and chemistry, but also the biodiversity groups, and even as Beth was showing on cultural diversity, we all found our cultural artifacts, we all found a lot of commonalities. So this is our final deliverable from the WorldFAIR case study, or part of it. Our deliverable is D4.3, and I'll provide the link in the final wrap up. So here we have been working on how we make human and machine readable provenance and persistence documentation for nanomaterials and policies. And again, we take some of the concepts from PROVO, which is the provenance ontology, and we now look at using our instance maps to give us a provenance trail, to also then give us a sample trail, which is the lighter purple, and linked to that then the data provenance trail. So what data we have about each about the nanomaterials at each point in that process. So really taking a sampling and an event-based approach. And I think that really is going to be transformative for how we do this in the nanomaterials field, because we've known for a long time that we need to document even things like when a jar of nanomaterials was opened, and we know they have a shelf life, and we know all of these things, but we haven't had an elegant way to capture all of that information. And I think now, through some of the cross-domain learning and how others are doing that, we have, I think, found a way that makes sense in terms of explaining it, and also makes sense in terms of operationalizing it, that doesn't take our researchers too far away from what they're already doing. The other main deliverable I wanted to highlight just briefly is the work that we've been doing on formalizing a workflow for making our nanoinformatics models and the software, the web applications associated with those FAIR. And that was building quite a lot on the RDA FAIR for research software approach, and just mapping it to what we need to do for nanomaterials. And again, looking at how we verify the data that feeds into the models, if they are data-driven models like QSAR models, but also then where we can use computational models themselves to generate descriptors or properties of our particles, how we can bring all of that in. Once we've then harmonized the data sets, we can then develop the models and document those models. So we've also been doing some work with the well-established QSAR model report form, and then working to formalize and remove the risk of errors in documentation of physics-based models as well, through what's called the MODA, or the model documentation template. So formalizing those as FAIR enabling resources, or FAIRs. And then also the steps then for how we verify the software and the deployment of the models, and mapping that to, as I said, the RDA FAIR for research software. So in summary then, we have three main sets of, or groups of activities. So we did a lot of work to organize and collate all the existing documentation tools and trainings to support FAIR nanomaterials data and modeling, and put those together into the mapping. So deliverable for D4.1 is the verification mapping. And then we have a nanomaterials prototype where we show how we implement that. The second set of deliverables is the verification of the nanoinformatics models. And we're just finalizing our milestone on demonstrating that. And we have the third one was on, as I said, the representing and identifying nanomaterials and provenance information, which all comes together in WorldFAIR D4.3 deliverable. And all of the outputs and learning is transferable to and from other interdisciplinary domains and is fully aligned with the cross-domain implementation framework. And then, of course, we don't do this alone. So I just want to very quickly flash up a lot of the partners who've been involved, but also to highlight 3 projects where a lot of the work developed in WorldFAIR is going to be continued. So Macrame, ARC, and Pink. So, and with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Isolde. And that message about how each of these case studies has been situated within a community, within a whole load of other activities, and has had to pull on these other developments, I think is really important, whether those are developments in other projects or in activities like RDA or elsewhere. I think we see that richness that each of the case studies has had to has benefited from, but also has had to deal with in terms of its complexity. Next speaker is Alexander Prent from the geochemistry case study. Alex, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Alexander Prent. I hope you can hear me okay and see the screen.
Yeah, all perfect.
So I've led the geochemistry case study or work package, and in that I was supported by Ozscope, the geoscience infrastructure provider for Australia, and of course CODATA in the WorldFAIR Project. Thanks for the support and all the help there. It's been great to work with you. And let's get on with some of the work we've done in the geochemistry case study here. As a long-tail community, there's a lot of subdisciplines within geochemistry. They generally produce really detailed and highly specific data that's very small data sets. So they're only kilobytes or megabytes in size often. And there's a bunch of things we set out to do in the work package, and we managed to do most of them in a really good way, and all of them toward geochemical data standardization and the fairer geochemistry data. Now, I'll start off with the take-home messages, really how to fare well, and from the geochemistry community, as Simon already mentioned, we can look at this as with its many disciplines, almost as an interdisciplinary question, how to work across disciplines within such a discipline itself. Now, in deliverable 5.2, we mentioned that FAIR can be looked at as a continuum. So you can have fairness within a small group of people within a data set. You can have fairness in larger groups, and I'll come to that in a minute. Then some of the other take-home messages are you should publish your FAIR enabling resources as soon as possible. So, for example, vocabularies. As soon as you make them available online, people can use them, people can map to them. That was very important. And then generation of FAIR implementation profiles for a subsequent set of data or a data collection or repository or a disciplinary database will also help making the FAIR enabling resources publicly available that define that data set or data collection. So that was something important to promulgate, publish those with the resources or the data set. FIPS can be used as an indication of fairness. So definitely when you generate a FIP, it becomes obvious what FAIR enabling resources are not existing for a data set or a disciplinary database or repository. And then assigning implementation choices, the FAIR principles and the implementation choices that go with them, to technical group of people that built the repository, or do they live with the community? Are they the responsibility of the community to come up with the technical side? And the community side are quite important to realize, so you can put responsibilities in the right groups of experts. And we generate a live reference FIP for groups that are developing repositories or databases. And I think that's also a useful document and a useful resource for the community as a whole. So the FAIR continuum, really, I think you can look at data granularity and each of these steps from left to right, the data set, data collection, disciplinary database, repository, they can each be FAIR in their own right. And as such, FAIR is really a continuum, I think, also for a community. The community size and the complexity of the community can grow from a local group that really communicates well and is interoperable and has reusable data in that local community, to the more complexer group of groups in the regional community, in the international community, or global community. And I don't think we should think of only a global community that is FAIR. Maybe that's the ultimate goal we should definitely aim for, but it's already really fantastic if we can make the step from a local to a regional group, and becoming more complex in the size of that group and having that group as a FAIR entity. Now, I thought a little bit about how would you go about combining those disciplines within geochemistry and a single data type and multiple data types. That's only really possible if you go away or if you interoperate between these in a higher level of abstraction. So you cannot work between data types on raw data because that's not information yet. One data type cannot use raw data from another data type because they need to be reduced in a different way. As such, you can only combine and interoperate on data at a higher level of abstraction. So information with information, for example, not raw data that's not useful in combining data types. So that's all in the second deliverable. And then here, as an example of the FAIR continuum, publish your FAIR enabling resources as soon as possible, be that they have been developed on a local, regional, or international global level. Just make sure that they are available for the community and promulgate them so they can be reused, and mapping or interoperating between them is easier done. Here again, the technical versus cultural or community-based FAIR guiding principles. Within red, technical implementations that are F3, for example, should be only developed or should only be looked at by people who built the repository and not so much by the community of researchers that analyze in the geochemistry the rocks. So blue are the domain relevant standards and practices. They should be developed by the community who works with that data and does not necessarily store it in large repositories. And then there's definitely some collaboration needed in A1.2, where blue and red. So this is quite helpful if you need to come up with solutions for these FAIR guiding principles and who to address to create them. Then here an example of how we've built this reference FAIR implementation profile. And I think this is really helpful for the community, especially people who build new repositories and are using FIPS to evaluate how FAIR their repositories or data sets, data collections are. If there's something missing, one can go to this reference FAIR implementation profile and pull the right FAIR enabling resource and an example, or even ask the group that's already using that, how to implement such a resource, in that making it more fair, their own stuff. That's all done with these groups, the EarthChem group, the OSGeochem group from the OSCOPE Geochemistry Network, and the GeoRock group from the DIGIS, and the collaboration in the One Geochemistry initiative. So here again, FAIR Continuum, publish FAIR enabling resources, generate, publish FAIR FIPS, use them for evaluation of fairness, and assign implementation choices through the technical or community. And I guess you can also think about creating a reference FIP for your community with the relevant FAIR enabling resources for that community. Reviewed outputs and deliverables. Here is a list, and thanks all for that. It's been a great 2 years.
Thank you very much, Alex. It really has. It's been a pleasure to work with you and with all the case studies and with all your colleagues from your community. I mean, we have one person speaking for each of these case studies, but they represent often a very large community of collaborators, people actually on the project and collaborators that were brought in. And that's been one of the richnesses. So thank you very much. And last but not least, we have one of those collaborators to talk to us about the chemistry work package. Ian Bruner from the Cambridge Crystallography Data Centre. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Can you hear me all right?
We can, yes, and we can see your slides.
Excellent, thank you. So yes, I'm presenting the sort of what came out of the WorldFAIR chemistry work package, but I need to acknowledge here Liam McEwen, who's been very much the driving force behind what I'm going to be talking about here. IUPAC has, for the last 100 years or so, been working to define the definitions and parameters that allow for a common systematic language for chemistry. This is thinking about what you call chemical substances, how you name them, how you represent them, and the terms and terminologies that are necessary to describe the processes and the that take place in chemistry, the properties of those compounds, and then quantities that are necessary to represent measurements. And IUPAC itself has also been in the business of generating evaluated data, whether that be the atomic masses that you'll find in the periodic table or measures of solubility. And it's this sort of foundation that fed into the WorldFAIR chemistry work package. And what we wanted to try and understand is how IUPAC standards might contribute to advancing the implementation of FAIR in the chemical sciences. And we had three main deliverables. One was around guidance, another around training, and another around services that might exploit and use chemistry standards. And I'll say a little bit more about each of those. But picking up on a previous point about this being sort of a case for collaboration, it wasn't just IUPAC involved. There were a number of other initiatives and organizations who are active in the area of providing chemistry data who contributed to all of these. So the guidance deliverable was an attempt by us to come up with a framework for those who might be producing guidance or developing policies or providing products and services as to what should be taken into account when pulling those together. We did a landscape overview which looked at the standards that are out there now, but also how chemistry data is being used in adjacent disciplines, and the kind of WorldFAIR project helped us sort of like have conversations with some of those as well. And we looked at case studies and current success stories in the chemical arena. And out of this came some sort of recommendations for what is really necessary if you're going to implement FAIR successfully in Cambridge in chemistry, around the reliability of how you are describing your results. The identity of substances, uncertainties on measurements, the units, etc., that associated with the numbers that come out of this. And then what's necessary in order for data to be processable and exchangeable, things like file formats and APIs. And when we looked at this, we realized that there's quite a lot out there that can provide a foundation from that, either through IUPAC's efforts over the years or through other initiatives. And that led to one of our sort of kind of key main priorities is that, yeah, it's important to remember we should be trying to take advantage of what's available out there now. We also need to think about targeted guidances and services that will facilitate best practice. And I think it's important there to enable the researchers to do easily what might not be quite so easy to them when it comes to sort of making their data fair. And then the need to collaborate broadly to establish cross-community consensus. So the utility services for chemical standards deliverable is an example of one of those services. There are out there many chemistry data resources out there on the web, and they've all got different information to offer. And the aim behind this was to think about an architecture that could make it easier for machines and researchers to sort of search across these in a common way. And so this deliverable has proposed a common schema for resolving chemical representations across resources. But not just that, it's also thought about the validation of the inputs. There are many different ways that you can represent structures, and not all systems understand things in quite the same way. And so there's a proposal within this deliverable for how a service can give feedback on whether it can understand a representation and what it understands about it, or whether it can't. And need to acknowledge here Paul Thiessen and Evan Bolton of PubChem, who've been participated in developing this specification, but also provided a working prototype that shows it in action. The next step is to think about rolling this out to other resources and sort of prove that we can use it to search across those as the sort of intention, as the aim initially was. Then the FAIR Chemistry Cookbook training deliverable. This was all about coming up with digital recipes for preparing and working with FAIR chemical data, and in particular highlighting why standards are important and how to use them. In pulling this together, we used a broadly accessible, easy to use platform based on standard infrastructure, Jupyter Notebooks, Python, Markdown, GitHub. And the aim is to make it easy for people to access this information, but it's so easy for people to contribute. And in thinking about how people contribute, there's been a sort of peer review model that has been developed so that people can contribute, others can review. And I think, again, if you look at the sort of number of project members, a number of people involved in this coming from different organizations all contributing. And this was a great exercise in encouraging this wider community to think about what online interactive training material might be useful in order to enable the fair publication of chemistry data. My final slide here is actually just to think about some of the broader benefits that came out of WorldFAIR participation. I mentioned all those IUPAC standards at the start, and very much at the forefront of my mind was how to make this legacy of standards, terminologies, and data machine accessible. I think here we found the FIT-FAIR methodology that's been talked about in other talks quite helpful to understand what's required to improve the fair maturity of these of the resources that we have out there. Good example of that is the IUPAC Goldbook, which collects together all the specific terms and is to some extent already machine accessible, but the FIT-FAIR assessment allows us to understand what's necessary. Simon mentioned at the very beginning the importance of the eye and the interoperability. And so participation in CDIF discussions, I think, has helped us think about what is universally necessary if you're going to be talking about chemicals across different disciplines, such as having a common chemical substance description. And then finally, the question of how to sustain this work into the future. And we were fortunate enough to be able to use some of the WorldFAIR funding to run a workshop in Cambridge in March this year, which brought together some members of other work packages, but others from the community, both in academia and industry, to talk about what it means to sustain digital standards. And out of that, we hope there'll be a white paper and that will feed into a roadmap for IUPAC as to how it should move forward in this area. So with that, I'll finish just to acknowledge all the people who have contributed to these various deliverables, thank the EU for funding, and RDA, and in particular the team at CODATA for coordinating across all these work packages that we've heard about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. So you have seen, I think, the richness, the diversity, the complexity of the WorldFAIR Project and its case studies. I'm sure that for people not involved with the project, there's quite a lot of information overload there. And yes, it has been a huge challenge, as well as an enormous pleasure, to coordinate those case studies and to learn from them. Are there any last questions? We've got about 10 minutes for any further questions or comments from participants. Anything you'd like to ask about the WorldFAIR Project as a whole, or to any of the particular case studies, particularly the chemistry and materials ones, or indeed any of them if you have such a thought. Please feel free to raise your hand or put a question into the chat. Carol, I see.
Yes, so Simon, I'll help out by asking a question. So I thought this was absolutely fascinating, and I was very impressed by the use of the FIPS framework as a very useful framing for being able to bring together communities. I was wondering, out of all of these projects, because they were very practical, were there any policy recommendations that you've merged that would have been useful to have had at sort of, say, a government level? I do have a reason for asking this, Simon. Is a loaded question, because I think what you were offering here was wonderful use cases of what is required in order to be able to do FAIR. But are there things that we can bring out at the policy level in order to be able to support driving forward FAIR in those communities?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. So today was the sort of the showcasing the, if you remember from my first slide, one of the missions, the mission of CODATA was to, of WorldFAIR was to advance the FAIR principles in a range of disciplines and cross-disciplinary research areas. And so here today we've done how did the case studies advance their adoption of the FAIR principles, interoperability considerations in their discipline. Tomorrow we'll talk about the synthesis, and that includes a reflection on the use of FIPS, it includes the CDIF, and it will include some of the policy things. We published a policy brief as we're required to as a European Commission project. I think it was about 9 months into the project. I don't think a lot of our argumentation has changed, but we are currently working on and writing the second synthesis of policy recommendations from each of the case studies and our reflections on that. That will be out at the end of the month. But I think the main arguments for to policymakers and to funders remains the same. If we're serious about interdisciplinary research, and if we're serious about advancing the research in any particular domain, we need to invest in data and in metadata. And obviously, from our perspective, we're particularly interested in metadata as the glue for interoperability, reusability, but also things like reproducibility, things like accuracy and verifiability, the transparency of the process. This is an area that we're particularly interested in. And in that first policy debrief, we described 2 case studies. How do you combine cross-domain data, and what do you need to do for that, and what are the policy requirements to support that? And how do you provide fine-grained access to data which might be sensitive? And each of these are really important in many research areas and require that investment in metadata. We're going to add a third in the next policy brief, which is AI, obviously. If we're serious about using AI for its best purpose, of understanding the constraints that may or may not be able to be placed on it, we need that investment in metadata and provenance again. So I think those are the things that I would highlight. And yes, thanks. Alex has put the link to the first policy brief in there. But a second one is on its way, but it's all a bit jumbled in my head at the moment.
Thank you very much, Simon. Sorry, I missed the opening. I had a clashing meeting at the beginning,
No
so
worries.
I could only come halfway through. But I was very impressed by all the presentations, I must admit.
It's been an incredible journey. It's been very rich. As a global project, we've never had a all project meeting in face-to-face. But we have leveraged, for example, the Gothenburg RDA, International Data Week in Salzburg, 2 Dagstuhl workshops. CODATA has a partnership with the DDI Alliance, and we do a Dagstuhl workshop every year. And every case study didn't attend those at the same time, but every case study did attend at least one of those Dagstuhl workshops. So we've been able to work together through that mechanism as well. Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for people's attention. I'm going to give people a couple of moments if there's a further question. Thanks. So is it known which projects would continue or new ones derived from those completed? Sorry, thanks, Veronica. I hadn't noticed the question part of that in the chat. In a sense, I mean, I think all of these will continue. We've talked about WorldFAIR Plus, and we hope that we'll continue to collaborate with all the case studies. We have some specific new case studies that are either assured or are likely for WorldFAIR Plus. But all of these case studies come from institutions or communities or groups that have an authoritative organization or have an RDA group or who have an existing collaboration. So I think they will all, WorldFAIR is one part of their ongoing life. But we certainly hope that we'll continue collaborating with all of them. That we certainly intend to. The CDIF, which will be published at the end of the month, will be a very comprehensive document, but it would be nevertheless a first draft, and it will be a basis for further discussion rather than the last word. We certainly don't have that hubris. And so that we hope that these case studies and others will continue to help us with that and input. So I hope that was that answered that sufficiently, Veronica, and I could give more detail if necessary, but I think we're beginning to run out of time. I can see colleagues leaving. So I'll release you. Some of you will be going to other RDA sessions, and you'll need some transition time. So thank you very much for your attention and participation. Please do attend same place, same time tomorrow to find out more about how we use FAIR implementation profiles, to have an insight into the cross-domain interoperability framework and some of our policy recommendations as well. Thank you very much, everyone.